What were the complex logistical, strategic, and tactical challenges of the D-Day operation in World War II? How did the Army break out of Normandy and lead to the liberation of Paris? What obstacles stalled Allied advance that led to Operation Market Garden? For answers to these questions and more Army History Insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum Enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. In this episode, we're looking at operations in Europe during World War II, from D-Day to Operation Market Garden. Now, these are in-depth battles, so we're only going to be addressing some key points today. We'll do a more focused podcast on these battles another time. But joining me for today's discussion is Dr. Dave Hogan. Thank you, Dave, for being here.
Delight. Always a delight to be with you.
Dr. Hogan is from Michigan, and he received his bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College in 1980 and his PhD from Duke University in 1986. After teaching at Elon College, he joined the U.S. Army Center of Military History all the way back in 1987. That's a long time ago, and I'm making a point of that for a reason here. Now, he's also the author of A Command Post at War, First Army Headquarters in Europe, 1943 to 45. He wrote Raiders, or Elite Infantry, The Changing Role of the U.S. Army Rangers from Dieppe to Grenada. He also wrote the book U.S. Army Special Operations in World War II. And finally, Centuries of Service, the U.S. Army in 1775 through 2005. And for 15 years, he taught an honors seminar at the University of Maryland, College Park, on American attitudes toward warfare and the military, and he also taught in Norwich University's online military history program. He is a former trustee of the Society for Military History and is currently working on a biography of General of the Army Omar Bradley. Now, that's a lot, but from what I understand, Dave, you're going to have a lot of spare time on your hands writing that biography of General of the Army Omar Bradley because you are about to retire from federal service.
That's right. It's been amazing, about 37 plus years, and came in during the Reagan administration, and leaving during the Trump administration.
Well, congratulations on all of your time and your service to the government and to the Army. And so this is going to be your last podcast with us. You've done many. So I really appreciate you being here. You've been a great guest, and I know our listeners are very happy with all of your insights. So congratulations again. Good luck on your retirement. So let's go ahead and jump into D-Day to Market Garden.
There you go.
So the long-awaited invasion of Europe took place on June 6th, 1944. Of course, this is known as D-Day. So can you describe the overall Allied plan for the operation called Operation Overlord and address some of the significant logistical challenges that they had to overcome to make this happen?
Overlord was an immense effort. And I don't think when the U.S. Army was first considering a second front in 1942 that they really knew the extent to which this was how much this was going to take. Eisenhower's directive was fairly straightforward, often used as a model. You will enter the continent of Europe in conjunction with other United Nations, undertake operations aimed at the heart of Germany and the destruction of our armed forces. So that was concise, clear. But trying to figure out how to do that, how to land hundreds of thousands of men on a defended coast, and it was thanks to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Atlantic Wall was much more substantial by the time the Allies came ashore, trying to establish a force ashore and maintain it there, and then establish all the different logistical apparatus to maintain it was just almost overwhelming. The plan for Overlord, when Eisenhower and Montgomery, who was his ground forces commander, showed up in January of 44, they felt the existing plan that the British Chief of Staff, Supreme Allied Command at Cossack had turned up was too narrow, too weak, just a 3-division assault. They wanted to expand it to 5 divisions, including a landing on the eastern shore of the Cotendon Peninsula. Now, we talked about this some with the Mediterranean podcasts, but very true as well with Normandy. This conventional wisdom is that you needed a port.
A port, right?
To supply this to supply this type of operation.
To sustain the battle, you've got to get logistics in there. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean the amount of supplies, ammunition, fuel, rations, all those different things to support a modern army. If they had landed in the Pas de Calais, there would have been, where the shortest distance between England and France, they would have had some ports, but they would have also run into the most opposition because that's where the Germans thought they would come. Mm-hmm. So, but by expanding the landing, they made it easier to get up to the port of Cherbourg at the head of the Cotendon Peninsula. Mm-hmm. And the original plan for Overlord was a plan for establishing a lodgment on the European continent. Mm-hmm. And the original plan was to drive in, force their way in through Brittany, and then open a path through Normandy, and then open a path into Brittany, where you had major ports like Brest, Lorient.
Okay, yeah.
That could provide more supply to the Americans. Ideally, by D+90 days after the invasion, the Allies would have established a lodgment from the Seine River on the east by Paris with the Loire River on the south. And they would then develop that as a springboard. They would build up the logistics for the assault into Germany. Right. And the invasion route that they were thinking of in May of 44 was more in northern Germany toward the Ruhr. The Ruhr was the immediate target. Berlin, of course, was the ultimate target, but the Ruhr was an enormous industrial area, still is, for that matter, an enormous industrial area central to the German war machine, and that was the kind of target that they set to get into the heart. But logistics, yes, that's very much driving this in terms of you got to get the ports. And in the meantime, before you could get the ports, I mean, they had the ducks, which we talked about.
The mobile trucks.
The mobile trucks.
Amphibious trucks.
Yeah, but for the invasion of Normandy, they came up with these amazing devices called mulberries, which are basically the Americans and the British just towed their ports with them.
Yeah, they're known as the Mulberry Harbors.
Yeah, harbors. They had what were called gooseberries, which were breakwaters, so were sunk ships that were used as breakwaters and then they actually manufactured prefabricated piers. Yeah. And
so these were just like gigantic piers that were built that could stretch out into the sea, so the ships could come in and download.
That's right.
A brilliant idea. Had something like that been used in warfare in the past, or was this something just unique to this operation?
There are probably things that can be somewhat like it. I'm naturally inclined to use the term first very rarely.
Right.
I mean, there maybe the Persians use some sort of floating,
but definitely unique part of this whole operation.
But on the degree of sophistication and scale. Particularly for the kind of logistics that we're talking about. Right. Yes, that was. So they expanded the landing, and through January and February, the planning is going on for this.
In 44.
And the amount of detail, the amount of thought that goes into this is incredible. Part of it is just with the Allies throughout World War II, a big problem was the shortage of landing craft. You never had enough landing. There were always, in fact, they moved the D-Day from May to June 44 because they could get another month's production of landing craft. And that was central to what they were trying to do. The timing was key. They could only land on the Normandy beaches. Normandy is among the most tidal-swept beaches in the world. And you know, the difference between high tide on the beach and low tide is enormous. If you land at low tide, you've got all this open beach to cross up before, covered by machine guns, artillery, everything else, before you can actually get inland. If you land at high tide, well, the Germans, Rommel took care of that because in that stretch between the high tide mark and the low tide mark, he put in all these obstacles. So if you come in at high tide, these obstacles will blow the bottom out of your landing craft. And so the Allies were trying to time this. They timed it at a particular time of the day, you know, just right about after dawn. So there would be a short preliminary bombardment. And they timed it in such a way that they would land just before the high tide. So they could get closer.
Okay.
And then, but also the obstacles would still be somewhat exposed, and engineers could go and blow those up. But there was a lot of methodical, detailed planning, and consequently, I think one of the things that really hurt them is they were so focused on getting ashore. And I've been through these where they lay out every ship has this unit on it. And then, oops, we got an LST sunk out in the Pacific. Well, okay, that LST is unavailable, and so they'd have to redo their.
Oh, wow.
You know, just all this painstaking planning of combat loading, the order in which you load a ship so that the most essential material is available to unload, and the build-up schedules, which got extremely involved. It was an exercise in detail. And consequently, the training exercises, training soldiers to assault these beach points, they got so focused on that they really didn't think so much about what they'd run into inland. And we can talk about that.
Wow.
The training, a lot of the criticism of the Americans is that they didn't take advantage of the British so-called funnies, these tanks, special tanks and armored vehicles that the British had developed for crossing the beach. They had flail tanks to dig up minefields, bulldozers, all those sorts. But the Americans just adopted the amphibious tank. And in the end, the amphibious tank was a disappointment because of the rough water. So many of them floundered in the rough water of D-Day.
And then, so we talked about the 5 beaches, right? Broken down in 5 different beaches, and then there were some airborne landings as well. So just kind of talk about that overall plan.
Yes, the 5 beaches. Utah was the beach that they expanded. That was actually on the eastern side of the Cotenden Peninsula. So if you're facing south toward the beach. The Cotenden Peninsula is on your right, and that's the peninsula with Cherbourg. And at the base of that was Utah Beach, where they were going to send across. They were sending the 4th Infantry Division under the overall leadership of J. Lawton Collins' 7th Corps. The next beach over, then you had this estuary where the Duvet and the Meteray, where the rivers flow into the Norman waterfront. And then there's Omaha Beach. And Omaha Beach was very difficult. Part of the problem, of course, was that an intelligence failure. The Americans did not realize that the Germans had positioned the 352nd Infantry Division and march. They had that division they had thought would be at Saint-Lô, which is about 30 some miles or so farther south. But instead, the Germans had moved that division up, and the Americans thought that they were only going to be facing so-called static divisions, largely made up of non-Germans that had been impressed into service. So that was a very nasty surprise on D-Day. And the 352nd wasn't just there in a training exercise, as some people thought. Yeah, they were there.
Oh, they were, yeah.
They were positioned there as part of the defense, and they gave the Americans a pretty rough time on D-Day.
Yeah, of the two beaches the Americans landed at, I think Omaha was the roughest one.
That was the roughest one. And then you had the three British-Canadian beaches to the east. Gold, which was the next one over. Juno, which is where the Canadians landed, and then Sword, which was near the mouth of the Orne River, just north of Caen.
Right. And then before the beach landings, they had the airborne landing.
Yes. The airborne troops, the original plan, and General Marshall, the chief of staff, was very big on airborne landings. He really wanted to use these in a major strategic role. And the original plan was for the 82nd and the 101st to drop across the southern Cotendon Peninsula so that you'd have the path readily set up to cut off the peninsula from the rest of France. And meanwhile, the British 6th Airborne would land in Pegasus Bridge and the Orne River, on the eastern side. Major John Howard and those guys, famous.
The Oxford and Buckinghamshire.
Yes.
Ox and Bucks.
And then the landing at Sword Beach would push through to get to the British airborne troops. But yeah, these guys were landing. They were landing in both as parachutists and as gliders, and the Germans were very careful to take open fields and put obstacles in them that would rip the bottom out of gliders. So it was a very dangerous undertaking. There was a plan. Practically on the eve of D-Day, Allied intelligence found that there was a German division that had moved into the western Cotendon. So they moved the 82nd Airborne, which had been supposed to go out there closer to Saint-Mère-Église, where they and the 801st would be very important in terms of clearing causeways off the Utah beach.
So before we go more into how those objectives were all achieved, let's talk a little bit about air power and the purpose and the effect of strategic bombing by the Army Air Forces.
You cannot really discuss the victory in Western Europe without talking about air power, strategic and tactical. And it was mostly the great equalizer. And if there's one thing the Germans have about D-Day and the aftermath, it's complaining about the Allied air power.
Oh.
But there was a reason why that air power was so significant, and that was because of the strategic bombing campaign, which had been going on. It started in 42 and been going on through 43. And the biggest thing that the strategic bombing campaign did was remove the German Air Force as a factor for D-Day. Absolutely essential, and really for the Northwest European campaign. Now,
about what point did I guess air superiority was achieved by the Allies?
Yes, and in 1943, the bombing campaign had not been going well. The Americans were trying to identify and eliminate choke points in the British and in the German war material. It's German system of manufacturing, particularly this interesting thing called ball bearings.
It was just coming to my mind too. Yeah.
Yeah, the Schweinfurt and those raids cost the 8th Air Force heavily. The Air Force had gone into this with the notion that the B-17 and B-24 bombers, extremely heavily armed, could fend for themselves in any air offensive. And as it turned out, a lot of them got shot out of the sky, and the losses were extremely heavy in the Air Force. But there was the introduction of the P-51 fighter, the Mustang, which had longer range, could escort the bombers, and and they play a key role as the bombers are nailing German industry. Those P-51s are up there shooting down German Messerschmitts, various German fighter planes, and inflicting an enormous toll. Now, air-ground cooperation is something that the generals get very worked up about, the Army generals, and General Bradley was not happy that there wasn't more pre-training work with the Air Force and air-ground cooperation. But the Air Force was busy during this period, basically eliminating the German Air Force as a factor.
Right. Yeah.
Not entirely, obviously, but pretty much as a factor for the campaign in Northwest Europe, and that would be of enormous importance.
What role did air power play in what we call today like tactical support? Was that even a thing then?
It took a long time to develop.
Yeah.
I mean, there had been some work on it in the Mediterranean. The Air Force really wanted to control the use of its squadrons. It did not like the idea of just, okay, we need this particular squadron to cover the 1st Infantry Division. We need this parceling out. Right. They wanted concentrated air power and bombing missions that were scheduled well in advance.
So they stayed more strategic or deep bombing?
To the Air Force, strategic bombing, hitting the enemy's vitals and manufacturing was that was the most important thing. Interdiction, where they went after railroads. That was a big part of D-Day, too, because the Air Force was bombing French railroads, bombing bridges, bombing anything that would help the Germans build up.
Yeah.
Because D-Day was all about the buildup. Who could get troops ashore? Who could get troops into the area faster? And to the degree that the bombers and the French resistance were able to slow down the German reinforcements rushing to the beachhead, they were contributing to the success of the landing.
So let's take a look at that a little bit more in depth then. So the Allies are coming, the airborne landings and then hitting the beaches. Talk about the success, some of the key points from that, and how did the Germans reinforce? How quickly were they able to get troops there?
Thanks to the Air Force, the Germans had a very hard time getting reinforced. They did get the 21st Panzer Division to the British beaches, and but really, the Americans just had a really hard time getting ashore at Omaha, and that was a pretty close-run thing. Part of the deal was that Bradley, the overall American commander, first U.S. Army. Bradley had wanted, he had this idea of strategic bombing, the sheer immensity, the power of it, and he wanted these strategic heavy bombers to blow the hell out of the German defenses along the Norman coast.
Right.
Well, the Air Force bombers had realized that their bombs were not as accurate as a lot of people thought they were, even with the Norden bomb site, the much ballyhooed Norden bomb site. And they were pressing in safety margins, so a lot of these bombs landed further inland. And when you take that along with the overcast conditions, D-Day, Air Force support, it was there, it was important, but it wasn't as apparent.
Okay. Yeah.
So these guys are coming ashore, and the naval bombardment is short. The Air Force isn't as effective on Omaha as it would like to be. And these Germans in their works are, I wouldn't say undisturbed, but there was not as much, they weren't as cleaned out as thought, and they put down a heck of a fire on these beaches. At one point, the Germans thought that they had eliminated the American beachhead at Omaha. And Bradley, who was offshore in the cruiser Augusta watching, thought he might have to pull the troops off of Omaha and put them ashore on another beach. Omaha was a very near-run thing. And
whereas at Utah, what kind of resistance did they meet over there?
Utah was relatively easy. Actually, accidentally, General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the assistant division commander of the 4th Division, landed with the assault troops south of below the main German fortifications by a twist of fate. And Utah, I mean, there were some problems. There were some ships sunk. There were casualties, but it was nowhere near as bad as Omaha, where the Americans were pinned down on the beaches. The 1st Division, the 29th Infantry Division, the blue and the gray from Virginia and Maryland, and it was a pretty near-run thing. Only two things really, in the end, got them off the beachhead. And the first being the support of the U.S. Navy. The Navy outdid itself on D-Day.
With naval gunfire.
With naval gunfire support. Destroyers cruising inland, risking grounding to hammer German targets from close up. And at one point, American 5th Corps Commander General Giroux, who's responsible for the Omaha beach, said, "Thank God for the U.S. Navy."
Oh, wow.
It was one of the finest moments of naval gunfire support. And the other thing that got them off the beaches was just small unit leadership.
Yeah.
People, NCOs, young lieutenants, captains, getting out front and saying, "We can either stay here and die, or we can go up the cliffs and die. Now let's go."
Right.
And that's we are forever indebted to the people who had that initiative, who were able to climb those cliffs. They were helped some by the fires started by some of the bombardments, and that masked some of their movements to where they could climb up work their way up these. Not all the cliffs were as sheer as what the 2nd Ranger Battalion faced at Point du Hoc on the western end of the beach, right. but they were steep enough, and I understand later they showed Soviet generals films of these landings, and the Soviet generals just couldn't believe the terrain.
Oh yeah,
as these guys were coming ashore.
And then what about the airborne forces? What kind of resistance did they face, and what was it like for them?
There was a lot of nervousness about the airborne forces going in. The General Lee Mallory, who was commander of the air support, said we could have something like 75-80% casualties.
Wow.
He did not want the responsibility but Eisenhower and Bradley felt that this was something that they really needed to do. That was crucial to getting off the beaches at Utah with the causeways and the flooded marshlands that were behind. And in the end, the casualties they were bad enough, but nothing like what had been feared.
But did they achieve their objectives?
They achieved their objectives. They managed to take St. Mary-Église, the key crossroads. They managed to open up the causeway so the 4th Infantry Division could get off the beaches. And they sowed a lot of confusion in the German rear areas. Particularly, there were a lot of dummy paratroopers that were dropped too.
Yeah, diversion, right? Yeah.
So they scattered these all, and it was hard for the Germans to pinpoint just where these
really creating that fog of war among the Germans.
Yes. Yeah, it was. Yeah, they just had a very hard time figuring out what exactly was going on. Of course, part of it was that the weather had been such. We remember, of course, that Eisenhower had to postpone the landing a day but he just found a bare window of opportunity, and a lot of the Germans had not thought the invasion would be coming. The Allies would never come in that kind of weather.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So that helped certainly with tactical surprise.
Well, now you mentioned earlier that there was so much emphasis put on the landings themselves.
Yes.
But, okay, so they secure the beaches, they start moving inland, and what happens?
Well, they start moving inland, and they suddenly find that they have some very difficult terrain to get through. Now, once the Americans got ashore at Omaha, and the beachhead was only about a mile or so deep at the end of the first day, and not near what they had been hoping for. But in succeeding days, they were able to expand that beachhead to a substantial extent. But in the Cotenden Peninsula, where the 7th Corps and the 4th Infantry Division were plowing through, they started to run into what were known as hedgerows. The phrase, I think, is bocage, but this
What is that? What's a hedgerow?
It's
Natural?
yeah. Well, over the centuries, Norman farmers in Normandy, had set up these fields which were separated by these earthworks. You know, you have this dirt, which may be about 4 or 5 feet high or so, and then you have hedges on top of it.
Oh, okay.
Growing off the top of it, which what you have are all these little hedgerow squares with these hedges that creates a series of fortresses.
Okay.
Which are natural fortresses for the Germans to defend. And the Americans find it very hard to get, their advance gets channeled, the sunken roads between these hedgerows that the Germans can easily cover with anti-tank weapons.
Right.
Machine guns, they can cover the area within the hedgerow. When you cross the field, you get hit with these machine guns. And the Americans lose an awful lot of people going through that. Consequently, it's a very difficult campaign. The Americans do finally, by June 19th, they had cut across the Cotenden Peninsula and isolated it. And then it took them another week for the 7th Corps to advance north up the Cotenden Peninsula and capture Cherbourg.
Okay.
Hitler had intended that Cherbourg would be a fortress that would hold out for a lengthy period of time and deny the Allies the use of that port. Well, with the help, again, of naval gunfire support, the Americans were able to break in and force the defenders to surrender. But it still would take months before Cherbourg would be up to its full operating capacity. Hitler was very thorough, and the Germans were very thorough. They blew all these ports, the piers, and it's only very fortunate that the Mulberrys were there to support as much as they were with the supplies.
Yeah.
And on top of that, about the time that they cut the peninsula, there's this massive storm that wrecks one of the Mulberrys.
Oh, no.
So there was only one Mulberry left. Yet somehow the Allies were able to get enough supplies to sustain this beachhead.
Was anything coming over by airlift at the time?
They brought some things by airlift. They had some airfields that they built on and they could bring some essential items. But a lot of it was just you see these ships called landing ship tanks. We actually have one in my hometown, and I understand Evansville has one. Those are the only two that are still around, from what I know. But these are vessels. They look a little like tankers, but they're long, they're flat bottomed, and they have a ramp off the front. And you can load them up with the vehicles, and you just lower the ramp, and off they go down. And initially, it took a little while for them to land these landing ship tanks, these LSTs, because of the observed artillery the Germans could fire on the beaches. But once the Germans were driven back, they could do what they called a procedure called drying out, where they would, at high tide, they'd bring these things, these LSTs in, and then once the tide ran back, they dried them out. They were sitting there on the beach, and then they'd lower the ramp, and down would come the vehicles onto the beach.
Oh, interesting.
But it was a very so there were these kinds of expedients, but it was very difficult, and eventually trying to get the right supplies ashore, and the lodgement, of course, was very cramped to begin with. There wasn't a lot of room, so you're building your airfields, you're building your supply dumps, you're bringing more and more and more and more combat troops, especially since you're trying to beat the Germans in terms of building up supplies. It gets to be very involved.
Moving inland, taking over the Normandy peninsula there, there's a lot of talk about the breakout of Normandy. So there's a new command in town who helps to do this. Can you talk about that?
Yes. Well, it takes time. Cherbourg falls on June 26th, and then in early July, the Americans start an offensive through northern Normandy, and again they run into all the bocage, the
hedgerows,
the marshes, what do they call them? Maurice, I think the name is, or whatever. These marshes that soldiers go into and they just bog down. Tanks bog down. Tends to channel the movement, which just makes the German defense even easier. But the Americans are learning. Part of it is that they're learning how to attack these hedgerows.
Mm-hmm.
So
they're adapting their
tactics. Yeah. The campaign of Northwest Europe is the U.S. Army's greatest campaign, and it's a combined arms campaign. Mm-hmm. This is how they win. Every arm is when they attack these hedgerows. They develop a system. There's engineers to burrow into the hedgerows and set explosives to blow a hole through them.
Okay.
They develop tanks that have these iron tusks on the front. They call them rhinoceros tanks. Where did they get the metal for that? All those obstacles from the beach have been blown up. So they welded all this before. Wow. During July, they're welding all this steel onto the front of these tanks, and they develop combined arms with the tanks, the infantry. They develop air-ground support. Mm-hmm. The Air Force brings in the 9th Tactical Air Command, and this is one air command that is focused on ground air support, close air support, and they develop very tight relationship. They start putting air officers inside of tanks, so that the air officer can report to it up to his field. There's an obstacle up ahead. Can you guys take it out?
Well, something that we continue to do through this day.
Yep. It was the heyday of combined, and this is when the U.S. Army and U.S. Army Air Forces at the time they're really developing these techniques of responsive air-ground combat, and they do that just as General Bradley comes up with his plan for the big breakout. The Allies, the First Army, finally gets down to the Saint-Lô-Perrier Road, which he wants to use as the jump-off point. And Bradley takes this sector, few miles by few miles, and in the front, and he concentrates 7th Corps against it, General Collins' 7th Corps, with exploitation, two armored divisions, 1 infantry division behind four or 5 infantry divisions. And again, Bradley, fascinated by the heavy bombers. This time the Air Force has got to come through with those heavy bombers to blow the German defenses to smithereens. Well, Bradley, though, wants them to approach parallel to the road so that they don't go over the American soldiers. And the airmen try to point out to him, you can't, given the time and space factors you're talking about, we can't do that. We have to go perpendicular. Somehow there's a misunderstanding. The Air Force goes perpendicular, and that's the infamous short bombing of Saint-Lô, which costs hundreds of American dead. But somehow these guys dust themselves off on the morning of July 25th after the short bombing, and the Germans are just stunned more than anything by this Panzerlehr, a very good division, is almost dead on its feet, but they still fight hard over a day, but Collins, who's the commander of the attack under Bradley, sees that there's a weakening in the front, and he commits his armor, and that's when the breakout occurs. And on July 26th, the front in Normandy blows open.
Oh wow! In which direction do they go?
They're going southwest.
Okay.
The original intent of this Operation Cobra was that it would cut off the Germans in the western part of the Normandy Peninsula. That 7th Corps would break south and then head southwest to the coast and catch all the Germans to the west in a sack. But Bradley and Collins adjust the plan so that more of an exploitation. And before the Americans know it, by the end of the month, they've captured Avranches, which is the gateway into Brittany.
Wow!
And the way is open. And at this point, George Patton enters the scene.
Yeah. And what does he take command of?
He takes command of the Third Army. The Third Army is introduced at this point. Patton had been itching. I want to get. I want to get into the into the battle. His mission initially is to take Brittany and take those ports. That's the priority, getting the logistics straight.
Right.
But it soon becomes clear that the German resistance in Brittany is pretty minimal, and that there's this wide open flank and dangling in Normandy, and Bradley and Patton just start feeding divisions through that. And Patton advances basically to Le Mans. And this is the start of what becomes known as the Falaise Pocket.
And soon after all this took place, we've got the breakout of Normandy, but now there's another invasion in southern France. So talk a little bit about that, a lesser-known invasion, and what was its impact?
The British fought Operation Anvil Tooth and Nail. Was later the name was changed Dragoon because Churchill said he had been dragooned into it.
Okay.
But the British had opposed, this discussion's going on all through the spring.
Oh, is it? Yeah.
And of 44. Ideally, Eisenhower wants the landings to be simultaneous, land on both the north and the southern coast of France. But available landing craft makes that impossible.
Oh, okay.
So they postponed that until August 15th. And about the time that the Americans are making their big surround of the German 7th Army in the Falaise Pocket, on August 15th, the American 7th Army and the French 1st Army are coming ashore in the Riviera. Later, this became known as the Champagne Campaign. But
the Champagne Campaign. I like it.
But the Germans in southern France, there just aren't as many. The resistance is rather weak.
Does it do anything to alleviate the forces
by that point,
in the north?
Well, by that point, the Germans in the north were pretty well disorganized, and the German army in Normandy was falling apart. So in that sense, but this is still a very important development because, as it turns out, the 7th Army drives up the Rhone Valley, up by the Swiss border, Strasbourg, Alsace, and we occupy those ports. The French First Army takes those ports of Marseille and Toulon, and those become absolutely essential as you move into the fall and the Allied supply crisis hits, because the supply crisis is coming. Now, I want to return quickly up to the Falaise Pocket, where Hitler tries to make a counterattack on August 7th, tries to break through to the coast at Avranches and separate the Allied armies, First Army and the British and Canadians to the north from the Patton's Third Army to the south. And if he had made it to the coast, he would have. But Americans in the area, notably the Old Hickory, the 30th Infantry Division, fighting up on Hill 317, fights heroically and stops the German offensive, at which point, and they're able to do it so well that Bradley just sends Patton around the around the German, around the German left flank, and tries what they call the short hook, aiming toward Argentan and Falaise in the German rear. And if they can close that, they've trapped the whole German 7th Army. And this is where Bradley, fearing that he's overextended, halts Patton at Argentan, short of Argentan, and there are other efforts to try farther on, but the upshot is the Americans do not understand how many of the Germans, I think, are in the pocket. They think a lot of them have already escaped, but a lot of them are still there. And the Americans go, okay, well, the Germans are probably evacuated, and they start heading east toward Paris, and it becomes a race to the border. With the Third Army, the First Army, and the British and Canadians up to the north. And this is when Paris revolts. And
well, and then who led the attack on Paris? How was Paris liberated?
Well, the French resistance, the original plan had been to bypass Paris. Most generals aren't terribly fond of street fighting.
Right.
And plus the fact that the Americans and Allies would then be responsible for Paris at a time when supply was getting tight. You have to remember that the Brittany ports, we were de-emphasizing those. The Germans were holding fortresses in each of these ports to deny them, precisely for this reason, to deny the Allies the logistical benefit of that.
Right.
So the Allies by mid-August are already thinking logistics, and logistics is already starting to be a problem. And if we have to feed Paris, that's going to take a.
Wow.
But in the end, they became concerned that the resistance, that there was going to be a bloodbath in Paris if they didn't act. And the French 2nd Armored Division, which was part of Patton's 3rd Army, was assigned to. At this point, it had switched to 1st Army, but had been with 3rd Army, but it was assigned to go into Paris. And with some assistance from the 4th Division, which was coming in from the south on Paris, they broke into Paris on August 25th and managed to secure the surrender of the German troops there without any of the threatened destruction.
Yeah.
They made a movie about that. Is Paris Burning?
Paris Burning, that's right. So good. So then we keep pushing north. You talked about the supply. If you could touch on a little bit, one of the great amazing logistical operations in the war is the Red Ball Express.
Well, what you have is you do have gas coming ashore. Gas is getting to be the big commodity in August. The 3rd Army, the 1st Army, the British, everybody's going through gas like crazy because they're just advancing so to such a degree. And we had been planning pipelines to bring it up to the front, but those pipelines had not been established yet. And you have this gas. How do you get it from the Cherbourg and from the Mulberry and from what ports you do have up to the front? And this is when they institute the so-called Red Ball Express. These divisions need about 21,000 tons, as much as 21,000 tons of supplies daily. The Red Ball symbol was had been used by railroad companies to mark express freight trains. So we just took the red ball and slapped it on the trucks, and they set a steady circuit of trucks. These highways turned into one-way highways. You'd go fairly slow, and you'd bring it up to the front, and then you'd return by another route and pick up more gas.
It was a big circle.
It was a big circle.
Wow.
Began
but
August,
over what distances?
Well, you figure from the beaches.
Hundreds of miles.
From the beaches. In 82 days, they delivered 412,000 tons of supplies.
Wow.
All in these 2.5-ton cargo trucks, which were one of the winning weapons of the war. American industry turned out all these terrific
But these
trucks.
units that did it was primarily African-American transport units.
Yes.
That did this and really supplied the Allied war
Worked
effort.
long hours.
Yeah. No, it was a struggle.
It was it was crucial because, and in the end, we did run short of supplies. We couldn't break through the Siegfried Line, the West German border, as we were hoping. But we were able to at least get up close.
So as we're moving further and further north, some of the operation starts to stall, and I think General Montgomery comes up with a plan.
Yes. Well, Montgomery really he realizes the supply situation, and he really wants to concentrate the supplies and units under his control. He wants to be the single ground commander, and he wants the thrust to be in the north. A single thrust that'll carry all the way to Berlin and win the war just like that. Eisenhower is leery of that. He doesn't think the logistics are there for it. He feels that a thrust like that would be too exposed. He wants to defeat the German armies west of the Rhine. And so you've got this thing going on all through the fall between Eisenhower and Montgomery. But Montgomery, who's normally fairly cautious, in his eagerness to to advance, actually takes this enormous gamble called Operation Market Garden, where he's got these three streams across his front going up into the Netherlands, ending at the Rhine, which is Arnhem. Arnhem is the town that's at the end of the Rhine. And the idea is to take this parachute force that largely has been sitting since Normandy and drop them behind the German lines to seize these bridges and highways, and then the British 30th Corps would make a thrust up the highway, all the British tanks, to link up with these and open a corridor up to the Rhine, get the Allies across the Rhine in expeditious fashion.
Right. It's three bridges. Right? The British are at the northern.
The British are at the Arnhem Bridge. The British 1st Airborne, the Red Devils, land just up by Arnhem. They missed their drop zone a bit, but they managed to fight through to the bridge. Problem is that the Germans have two Panzer divisions that are headquartered right near there. They're not as. This is a period when they're trying to reconstitute these divisions, and they're not as strong as they could be, but it's still a very strong force. So what happens is the 101st Airborne Division takes Nijmegen, opens the corridor that far.
That's the furthest one south.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the 82nd lands and takes Grave, and they manage to just get the bridge through, but that's as far as the column can get.
Oh, wow.
The 1st Airborne, the British Red Devils and the Poles are left hanging up at Arnhem, and the Germans overrun them. And
so they don't succeed in
this is where the phrase "a bridge too far" comes from.
Bridge too far.
So Montgomery's gamble fails, and which leaves most of Holland still under German occupation through a very difficult winter.
So what time are we? Is this September of 45?
Market Garden is September 17th, 44.
Okay. All right. So I think we're going to end our overview there, and we'll be picking it up again with another podcast to take us through the overview of the Army's role in World War II from post-Market Garden. But now, again, before we close, it's time for our HUA trivia. So what piece of significant Army trivia can you share about this time period?
George C. Marshall, as Chief of Staff of the Army, was very careful at who he selected for his Corps, Army, Division commanders. And if somebody had a black mark against them, they wouldn't get the job. Well, there is a legend out there. I've heard it's more of a legend now, but it might explain some things. About this one particular officer. He was a classmate of Eisenhower and Bradley at West Point in 1915. The class the stars fell on, West Point lore. Very capable officer, but his name gets confused with somebody else who Marshall knows as a drinker.
Oh no! What was the name?
That's the trivia question. This guy at D-Day he starts as a mere colonel in the 4th Infantry Division, and commanding a regiment in the 4th Infantry Division. He performed so well that they quickly give him the 90th Infantry Division to fix, and then he moves up to 3rd Corps and becomes the Corps commander, and then the 8th Army commander in the Korean War.
Oh.
And who is this figure?
Ooh.
James Van Fleet.
James Van Fleet. And he almost didn't get it because
of a confusion over a name.
Oh, wow. Oh.
That's the legend anyway.
That's the legend, yeah. But luckily things worked out.
Luckily things worked out for him.
Cool. All right, well, thank you, Dr. Hogan, for your insights today about the Army's role in World War II from D-Day through Operation Market Garden here in World War II. And if anyone wants to learn more about the Army's role in World War II or learn more about Army history in general, please explore our website at history.army.mil. And if you want to experience Army history every day, then visit our social media sites on Facebook, X, and Instagram. Thanks for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds, and until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.